Today, I'm going to tell you about the time I saw a real demon possession when I went to Haiti on a mission trip when I was just about 15 years old. In my opinion, the most interesting thing about this experience was how closely it matched demon possessions recorded in the Bible, but I'll talk more about that later. I went on a mission trip to Haiti with my dad back in 2012 when I was about 15 years old. The mission trip was a month long, and we did a range of things from building a house inside of an orphanage to showing the Jesus film to about a dozen villages to feeding a bunch of villages. We were staying about a mile away from the orphanage that we were working at, and the walks to the orphanage were one of the most interesting parts of the day, in my opinion. Everyone on the streets would yell, "Blanc, blanc," which means white, since seeing a white person was apparently pretty rare. About a dozen young kids would walk with us down the road, and the streets were always bustling with people riding on donkeys or carrying baskets of food on their head or heading to the market. One group of people that was particularly interesting to me were the voodoo priests, who were easy to identify because they always wore clothes with bright red and blue colors. I remember on one of the walks to the orphanage counting 3 different voodoo priests on the road. The location of the orphanage was particularly important for voodoo because the fork in the road was well known for being a place where spirits would cross. Also, you could often see voodoo ceremonies happening on the sides of the street where there would be a gathering of about 30 people dancing closely together while someone played the drums in a rhythmless manner. I was told by the locals that this sporadic playing of the drums showed that this was a voodoo ceremony. And oftentimes at night while laying in bed, I could hear in one direction the loud singing of Christians in a church building, and in the other direction the loud rhythmless drums coming from a voodoo ceremony. The white lady who ran the orphanage told me that one time she saw a voodoo priest pour water over someone's head in a voodoo ceremony, and suddenly that man fell onto the ground and started flopping around like a fish. I also heard more about the local voodoo practices from one of the head pastors at the church there, whose parents had been voodoo priests when he was growing up. Voodoo was so rampant that I even heard it had mixed in with the Catholicism there. All of this to say, voodoo and spiritual encounters were not uncommon where I was in Desaline, Haiti, and so it's not surprising that I saw a spiritual possession during my short time there. It was during a nighttime crusade, which was basically an outside evangelism event hosted by one of the residents at the orphanage that I was working at. He had spent all day working with people to set up this massive stage outside beside the street where they would have worship late into the night. When I went to the event, there was a large crowd of people worshiping as the worship leader kept singing the same repetition in Creole, which was the language they spoke in Haiti. There was also a voodoo ceremony going on just across the street with about 30 people. As I stood in the crowd of people worshiping, I noticed 2 people rolling on the ground. At first I thought it was simply a form of charismatic worship that I hadn't seen before, but then one of them started screaming and shaking on the ground. She looked like she was probably in her 20s, and suddenly everyone in the crowd started chanting something in Creole while kind of slinging their arms forward every time they chanted. It was very surreal, and it was obviously an attempt to exorcise the spirit. But the girl's screaming got worse, and she started ripping out her hair. Everyone continued to chant, and then she started throwing off her clothes. At this point, my dad told me to look away since I was just a 15-year-old kid, but as things continued to escalate, he said for us to go. So we left as the crowd was still trying to exorcise the spirit. But thankfully, the next day, I was able to ask someone who stayed what ended up happening. She told me that eventually the woman who was possessed lay down on the ground like she was asleep, and then some people picked her up and carried her away. Now, one thing that I find very interesting about this is how closely it matches one of the demon possessions that Jesus encounters in the Gospels. So basically, in Mark 9:14 and following, Jesus comes down the mountain and meets back up with his disciples who have been trying to cast out a demon from a boy, but they haven't been able to successfully exorcise the demon. There are 3 interesting similarities that I find between this story and my own experience. First, Jesus' own disciples weren't able to cast out the demon, just like how the Christians I was with weren't able to cast out the demon from the woman. Second, the spirit causes the boy in Mark to harm himself by trying to throw him into a fire or water. The woman that I saw was also harming herself by pulling out her hair, and in both possessions, they convulsed uncontrollably. Third, in the cases of both exorcisms, they eventually lay still on the ground. Now, I realize that the story in the Bible isn't exactly like mine, but the reason I'm pointing out the similarities is to show that there continues to be evidence of things happening today that are similar to the kinds of things that happen in the Gospels. It is not as though the Gospels present a highly mythologized account that is far removed from eyewitness testimony. Rather, eyewitnesses, such as myself, continue to report seeing the same kinds of things that one finds when reading the Gospels. This is important because atheists, operating under the assumption of naturalism, often presuppose that the Gospels can't be historically reliable because in the modern era we know better. We know there aren't spirits or miracles or anything supernatural. And while I don't think that my experience proves that the supernatural is real, I think it does show that it is possible for an eyewitness to report seeing the same kinds of things that the Gospels describe. And therefore, naturalism should not be an argument against the view that the Gospels come from eyewitness testimony. It is not just spiritual possessions, but also countless other miracles like those reported in the Gospels that continue to be reported today, as Craig Keener's work on miracles has demonstrated. Therefore, if anyone argues that the Gospels don't accurately depict the world as we know it to be in the modern era, remember that when you step outside of the comfort of your own bubble, you can often find countless people who do claim to have encountered the same types of things that are recorded in the Gospels. Thank you, and please subscribe.